Today we want to talk about the theme of God with us. We're in a season of Advent, and we're trying to think through how to go about the season of Advent the way the church has taught us to. And the way to think about Advent, I think, best is it's a season of preparation, expectation, and anticipation. But the question that you always have to ask is preparation, expectation, and anticipation of what? And the way that the readings in the church's wisdom are set up for the Advent season, it's actually two things that we're to prepare and expect and anticipate. One is the first coming of Jesus in humility at Christmas, and the second is his coming again at the end of history in glory to judge the quick and the dead. And we're talking about both those things in this series. Today we're focusing on the first, God with us, the miracle of Christmas, the reality of what theologians call the Incarnation. So we're thinking about the fact that the author of the story actually entered the story. As one Sunday school child once put it, Jesus is God with skin. That's what Christians actually believe. Let me remind all of us as we begin that this is something that we confess in the Creed every week in the middle of the Nicene Creed in the section on Christ. For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven, and here comes the key phrase, by the power of the Holy Spirit, he became incarnate from the Virgin Mary and was made man. So our focus today is on the simple but profound and mysterious truth that at a moment in history, God actually became a man in space and time and walked among us. In J.B. Phillips' wonderful phrase, we live on the visited planet. And the question is, what is it that we're talking about when we talk about this truth that God became a man? Now, there are lots of ways to try to get at this. I want to use really one book of the Bible to focus our attention on today, and that is the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah has a lot, I think, to offer us as we think about this truth. We're thinking about God becoming man. And here's the important sort of perspective to begin with. Most Western Christians, in my experience, don't get the full weight of the Incarnation because they lack an understanding and a proper emphasis on the first part. That is to say, the God part. Most of us have a pretty good idea of what a human being is. We know more than we've ever known before in history about the fact that we're emotional and personal and spiritual and physical and all these things. And we're very complex beings. We know a lot about it because we have the experience to base it on, and we have other people that we see who are also human. But God is very unlike us. And the problem with the Incarnation is if you don't get God high enough, then you don't get the full weight of how far down, as it were, God had to come. What's missing in almost all of Western Christianity is a deep and abiding sense of the awesomeness, the mysteriousness, the holiness, and the majesty of God. Now, Isaiah is a great book to talk about with regard to this, because Isaiah is a book which is filled with an emphasis on God's greatness, God's holiness, and God's majesty. You probably already know these passages, but if you're not familiar with them, I want to make sure that you follow along. I want to start today in Isaiah 6. It's early on in the book of Isaiah. The king has died, and Isaiah is in grief about the sense of loss. This is a major loss, as it would be for any American if the president died, as it would be for anybody in England if the monarch died. It's a time of big transition. It's a significant national event. And it says at the beginning of chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train fills the temple. What's happened is at night, Isaiah's gone into the temple to worship and to try to pull things together and to try to get some perspective on the fact that this time in history is a time of transition, a time of loss, a time where he needs to get the proper perspective and to see as God sees. And if you remember, it's an amazing vision that unfolds to him as he goes in the temple. It's at night, and he sees this resplendent, lit-up scene that he describes this way. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple, and above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings, and he sees all these angels, and he hears this chorus, which is actually, believe it or not, Anglican liturgy, as I like to joke with my friends. They're all Anglicans in heaven. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Of course, I say that jokingly, but the scene is one where God's holiness is the big focus. And holiness is a very important aspect of God's character when you think about Christmas that you almost never hear in relation to Christmas. Because God's holiness is a reference to God's character that speaks to the fact that he lives in a wholly other order of being than you and I. Holiness is God's moral purity, God's absolute and total transcendence, and his absolute difference from everything that he's made. Holiness is so profound that when it's experienced in a very significant way by people in the life of the church over the years, it renders them speechless. And this is certainly Isaiah's experience. Woe is me, he says, for I am lost, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. God's moral purity, God's awesomeness, God's full of light to such an extent that in him there is no darkness at all, which makes Isaiah acutely aware of his own darkness. So he says, woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. So the first thing that we want to make sure that we get in touch with is the God with whom we have to do, the God that we confess faith in, who came down at Christmas, is the God who was high and lifted up in the temple before Isaiah, and who's a God of absolute majesty, moral purity, and holiness. So much so that if we ever encountered him in the fullness of his being, we would want to drop dead. We would want to fall on our faces and apologize for being who we are, because we'd be so acutely aware of our own inadequacies and our own sinfulness immediately in the light of his moral purity and his goodness and his greatness. Now the next passage I want to make sure to remind you of is one that you may know well because Handel's Messiah uses it. But it's a great passage to talk about when you talk about the mystery of Christmas. It's one of the readings that's set aside for Christmas in the lectionary, and it's one of the best choruses in Handel's Messiah, and one of the ones that's well known. I'm in 9 of Isaiah, the 9th chapter, and beginning of the 6th verse. The passage is talking about the birth of a child, but in the wisdom of the church and the interpretation of Scripture, it's always been seen that the child that's being spoken about here is giving us hints about the birth of a messianic king who's coming. You know the passage. See if these words are familiar. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Now here's the language that I want you to pay attention to. And the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called, and here comes Handel's Messiah. I bet you can hear it in the background. Wonderful Counselor. Now, I paused because Handel's Messiah paused. The old King James Version has a comma there. It's not in the original. It's not in the Hebrew. The way it reads, according to our best manuscripts, is Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So the one who is coming is described as someone who's so great and so majestic and so awesome that he holds the government on his shoulders. He's Wonderful Counselor, he's Mighty God, he's Everlasting Father, he's Prince of Peace, he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is not somebody who's safe, but it's somebody who's good, it's somebody who's awesome, it's somebody who's majestic, it's someone who's a great God who calls for and deserves nothing less than total worship because of the great being that he is. And you get a sense from Isaiah of his greatness. Now all this is to build God up for us before we get to Christmas. I'm still not done. There's another part of Isaiah I want to make sure to reference as we go forward, and that's later in Isaiah. He's trying to teach the people of God, and therefore also you and me, to think of God in ways that are great. And in Isaiah 40, he tries to get us to do some sort of mental calisthenics and to make sure that we haven't made God too small, that we've not brought God down to us, but we've appreciated God for who he is on his own terms. And it's a great section of Scripture, Isaiah 40, because he takes various aspects of our own experience and says to us, look, think about this and then take it and work it up to God and make sure that you understand. Isaiah says, look, think about the tasks that God has done. Think about what we believe as Christians that God has accomplished. You sense somebody's character based on their accomplishments. That's one of the ways that we evaluate other people. So I'm beginning at the 12th verse. Who's measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span? Who's enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord and as his counselor instructed him? Behold, the nations are as a drop in the bucket and are accounted as dust on the scales. So you can see that Isaiah is really pushing language, one would have to say, all the way to its limit to try to get us to understand the greatness of God. Look at the tasks God has done. Look at the nations. I mean, when you think of something like the former Soviet Union, I speak to you as someone who visited the former Soviet Union in 1977. It was always amazing to me just the sheer size of the place. It has the most time zones of any country that the world has ever known. The time zones just go on, and you go there and it's just so vast, bigger than you can imagine. America, Australia, these are nations, these are big entities, lots of people, lots of stuff going on. And Isaiah is saying, when you think of a nation, you think of yourself, you get very small very quickly, right? There's 300 million people roughly in the United States today. If you think of 300 million, you think of yourself, you start getting a sense of how small you are and what it means to be part of a big country. One of the things that's going on right now is we're trying to get our minds around what it means to deal with China. And in China, there's 1.2 billion with a B people, which means that they're 4 times as big as America. Imagine that number. You start feeling smaller. And what Isaiah is saying is, think about the tasks that God has performed, and think about the things in your own experience that get you to think of greatness, like nations, bigness, mightiness, power, majesty. And what you then need to realize is, to God, nations, like the former Soviet Union or China now, or the United States now, to God, they're like a drop in the bucket. That's how big God is. God goes on and on and on and on. Now, the last thing I want to bring to you is something that you know probably from your own experience. And it comes partly from my family, because my father was a chemistry teacher and he had a lifelong fascination with astronomy. But this is one of the places, actually, where contemporary science really helps us as Christians, because we have some idea now, in a way that we haven't before, of the sheer size of the universe that God has made. When I use a phrase with you like the vast reaches of interstellar space, I hope you have some sense of the incredible size of the thing that we're talking about. We don't really know how big the universe actually is, but it goes on and on in ways that defy our imagination to even begin to understand and unpack and take in. And that sense of vastness and expansiveness, when you go out at night and you look at the stars, and you look at the planets and you get a sense of your smallness in the light of just one place in this just one galaxy. And then you think that through astronomy we know that it's galaxies upon galaxies upon galaxies. And that the universe is a constellation of all of these things and an amalgamation of all these things. So that even something as vast for you and for me as a constellation or as a galaxy, that's less than a drop in the bucket to the universe, and God made the universe. It's an outworking of his wisdom and his power, which means God is greater than that. So we have a sense of the vastness of the thing. And you see, it's when you start thinking this way, God's holiness, God's greatness, God's majesty, wonderful counselor, almighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, when you get those kind of images in your mind, that's when you're in a position to appreciate what we're actually saying that we're getting ready for at Christmas. And that is that there came a moment in time when God became a human being. The miracle that we're getting ready to celebrate in Advent, which is the miracle of Christmas, is nothing less than what John says in John chapter 1 is this. God became flesh, and the phrase is tabernacled among us, dwelt among us. And we have beheld his glory, John says, full of grace and truth. And what takes John's breath away, and what needs to take our breath away, is the God who is bigger than all those reaches of interstellar space and bigger than all those nations, and who accomplished all the tasks to create the universe and all its beauty and its vastness and all of that. The God who's so much bigger than all that we can ask or imagine. That great and awesome and magisterial God is the one who came all the way down. So think. Again, stay with me and think as an analogy in science, because there's something else we now know about the modern world that we didn't know before, and that is, it's not just that it's awesome and big and complex going that way, that is to say going up and out in terms of its size, but it's also very awesome and complex going down. And we've got people like scientists that work at a place called CERN, which is in Switzerland, where they take these huge, massive machines and drive subatomic particles into each other to try to figure out what actually makes up the smallest points of matter. When you and I were growing up, something like an atom was considered kind of the smallest thing, maybe an electron. But now we know that there's things like neutrinos and quarks and things that are so small that they were undetectable and unknowable up until the point where we got instruments where we could do these kind of experiments. And what you have is you have a sense of the smallness of the smallness of the smallness of the small. And that stuff matters. Quarks and neutrinos are part of the ingredients that make up the mystery and the beauty of life. And what you're talking about then is you're talking about the vast reaches of interstellar space coming down, and it is as if they become a neutrino. Not just an atom, not just an electron, but a neutrino. That's to say, the biggest thing you can imagine fitting into and becoming the smallest thing that you can imagine. And this is why Christmas is considered such a big deal. It's never happened before, and it's never happened since. It is the great miracle of the Christian faith. It's one of the principal feast days of the Christian year. It needs to take our breath away. Let me give you two things to get you to sort of acknowledge the truth of Christmas before I go on and ask some more practical questions. For me, Christmas has to go to music, it has to go to poetry, because you can't capture the sheer awesomeness of the thing in any one image, in any one chord, in any one chorus. One of my favorite prayers and poems about Christmas is called Sharon's Christmas Prayer. I think Christmas is a season for children. I think children help us with Christmas because they get at the wonder of the thing. And Sharon's Christmas Prayer, which is written by John Shea in his book, The Hour of the Unexpected, is about a girl who is 5 years old. And let me read it to you, because it's a great story and image and use of words to get at the mystery and the wonder of Christmas. Listen. She was 5, sure of the facts, and recited them with slow solemnity, convinced every word was revelation. She said they were so poor. They only had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to eat. And they went a long way from home without getting lost. The lady rode on a donkey. And the man walked. And the baby was inside the lady. They had to stay in a stable with an ox and an ass. Hee hee. But 3 rich men found them because a star lighted the roof. Shepherds came, and you could pet the sheep, but not feed them. Then the baby was born. And do you know who he was? Her quarter eyes inflated to silver dollars. The baby was God. And she jumped in the air, whirled around, and dove into the sofa, and buried her head under the cushion, which is the only proper response to the good news of the Incarnation. That's what kids give you. There's something about that poem that gets at it. It's just, the baby was God. Even at 5 years old, she couldn't say it and stay the same. She had to dive under the cushions because she wasn't sure she could take in a world where something as wondrous and amazing as that actually took place. That's a poem to get you started. You definitely need to listen to Handel's Messiah if that helps you. The other thing I wanted to do is to tell you a story. This is a famous story. I've used it where I serve here at Christ St. Paul's before, and some of you may know it because Paul Harvey actually uses it every year. It's one of the best stories of Christmas. But the reason why it's helpful is it gets at the sheer wonder and the awesomeness of the thing through the lens of the experience of somebody that maybe some of us can relate to. So here's the story. We really don't know who wrote it. Nobody's been able to figure it out. But it's called The Parable of the Birds, or The Man and the Birds sometimes. But it's a story that I think is very good at helping us understand the mystery of God becoming a man. of the fact that Jesus was God with skin. Listen, he was a kind man. He was not a Scrooge. He was a decent and mostly good man. He was loving to his family and upright in his dealings with other people. The problem was, he simply did not believe the nonsense that people talked about at Christmas time. All this business about God becoming a baby, born in a manger. He was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just could not swallow the Christmas story. Why would God ever want to become a human being? I'm really sorry to disappoint you, he told his wife, but I'm not going to church with you and the children this Christmas Eve. I would feel like a hypocrite. He told his family that he was happy for them to go, and he would wait up for them. And so he stayed home on this particular Christmas Eve while his family went to the service without him. Snow had been falling all evening. Shortly after the family drove off, the man went to the window. The flurry of snow became heavier and heavier, and it looked as if the temperature were dropping, he noted to himself. And then he went to his fireside chair and settled in to read the newspaper, as was his custom. Minutes later, he heard something that startled him, which was a thud, and then another thud, and then a third thud. At first he thought that someone was maybe throwing things at the house, but when he went to the door to investigate, he found, to his surprise, a flock of birds huttered miserably in his front yard in the snow. They were caught in the snowstorm in a desperate search for shelter. They were trying to fly through his large picture window. Well, I can't just let the poor creatures just lie there and freeze, he thought. Pausing, he considered what to do, and he remembered that the barn where his children kept their pony was not far away, and so maybe he could go out and kind of coax the birds into the shelter of the barn. So he quickly put on his coat and his boots and tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the big doors wide, he turned on the light, and the birds didn't move. Didn't matter what he did, they would not come into the barn. Any other man at this stage might have left the birds to their plight, figuring he'd tried what he could. He'd made the shelter available. If the birds didn't want it, that was not his concern. But he was a man of genuine compassion, so he paused again and tried to figure out if there was another way to go about his problem. Perhaps food would entice them. So he hurries back to the house, he gathers up some scraps of food, goes back outside, sprinkles the crumbs in the snow from the birds to the barn, makes a nice orderly trail, and to his dismay and frustration, it didn't matter how hard he tried, the birds didn't follow. So then he tried catching the birds, which I bet you won't be surprised to hear, didn't work either. He tried to shoo them into the barn by dancing around them and waving his arms. But instead they just scattered the birds in every direction, except into the warm stable, which is the direction he wanted them to go. Suddenly, the essence of his dilemma grasped him. He wanted to help the birds, but the birds were too senseless to understand. They did not even know what they needed, much less that he was there to help them. To them, he thought, I'm just a strange, terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know they can trust me and that I only want to help them. But how? And he moved and made more gestures and directions, and he frightened and confused the birds some more. They were beginning to die, but still, didn't matter what he did, they wouldn't follow his direction. With no awareness of what was coming, he said to himself, very tired now, very frustrated. If only I could become a bird. I could join them there in the snow and speak their language and tell them not to be afraid and to show them the way. And then he paused. And all of a sudden, you know what I'm going to say. It hit him. The darkness and the falling snow and the uncertain look that crept across his face. He started thinking, and he said to himself, but that would mean I would have to become one of the birds so that they could see and understand on their own terms. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The music of Christmas reached the man's ears above the sound of the wind, and he stood motionless, straining to hear, frozen not by the cold, but by something else. And as the bells pealed the good news of Christ's birth, the man sank to his knees in the snow. It's a good story because it gets across the sheer wonder and also the challenge and the distance of getting across. But we're not talking about a man becoming a bird, as hard as that is to take in. We're talking about something much, much greater and much, much more awesome than that. We're talking about the great and awesome God who made the universe coming into the universe as a tiny, helpless child. Fairest Lord Jesus, as the hymn has it. Ruler of the heavens. And yet, there he is, in that little manger, in that stable, on that day, looking very poor and very unable and very incapable and very needy. So that's the truth that we celebrate at Christmas, that God came and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. That's the miracle of Christmas. Let me say a few things about the implications of this, and then we're done. When you think about Christmas and what it actually means, it's important to pause and ask the hard question about where it actually hits you in your own experience. And about it, I want to say a couple of things. The first, and I think the most important thing, is when we say God with us, the hope of glory, which is a phrase from St. Paul in one of his letters, it's not simply the truth of a moment in time at Christmas. It's the truth of all of our lives all the time. That is to say, to believe in the Christian faith and to take the Christian faith seriously and to be what one might call a Christmas Christian is to believe and to understand that no matter where we are, no matter what our situation, no matter what we think about whether God is there, we nevertheless know that God is with us. God with us is not simply something that happened at a moment in time in history on the day of Christmas, although it is that. It's also a truth that's true every day of our lives. So that as a Christian, I am to believe that everywhere I go, there God is. Not simply as the God beyond me to be worshipped, God the Father, although that's true, but the God alongside me, God the Son, with me in the trenches every day of my life. It is a transformative thing when somebody that you care about comes into your presence with their presence. If you're in a room and you're by yourself and then somebody else comes in, it changes things. One of the best stories I ever heard about the meaning of this came to me in a very strange way. It was early on when I got out of seminary. I was serving in an Episcopal church in Sumter, South Carolina, and I went to a Methodist revival at the nearby Methodist church, and they had a speaker there who was a lovely guy named Reginald Mallet, and he told a story that even to this day I've never forgotten because it's such a great illustration of this image of God's presence with us. He told the story of the death of his father. He grew up in Northern Ireland. He was one of several children, and it was one of those situations where they could tell what was going to happen before it happened, and so each child went into the hospital room for one last talk with the father, and they went in birth order. And when it came to his turn, there he was in the hospital room with his dad. I just paused to note here, that's kind of an interesting scene to think about. What do you talk about with somebody at that point? You don't talk about the weather. It's probably the last conversation with them you're ever going to have. So what do you think they talked about? Well, as he related the story to us, what he talked about was, of all things, the first day he went to school. It's just the kind of thing that a father and a son would talk about, one of the great memories that they had together. And he's talking about leaving the family home in Northern Ireland and walking to school. And he says, I went this way and I went this way. And he's telling the story and he's talking to his dad and he's trying to take in the full weight of the fact that his dad's about to go from this world to the next. And all of a sudden, something starts bugging him and he can't figure out what it is. And he goes on with the story. And he left home and he was all by himself and he's walking through the streets of Northern Ireland in this particular place. And what he realized is, what was bugging him is his father was finishing his sentences for him and describing his route exactly correctly before he did. Which means that his father knew where he went, but his father wasn't there. And this kept happening. So finally he stopped and he said, wait a minute, Dad, how did you know where I went? You were back at the house. And he looked out to us and he said, well, you know, he said, I haven't ever told you this before, but it was your very first day at school. And so I went behind you carefully and quietly without letting you know, just to make sure that you made it there safely. He was secretly following his son the whole time. It was a single event in his life, but it was utterly transformed by the memory that there was someone there who had always been there, that he never realized was there. That's the fantastic image of the wonder of Christmas in terms of what it means. Now, I want to say something practically to those of you who are parents and godparents and grandparents. I can hardly convey the full weight of my passion on this point. There's almost nothing more important to convey to kids than this truth. Because it doesn't matter what you do with a child, they're vulnerable, and you're not going to be able to protect them, and you're not going to be able to be there every single moment of every single day of their lives, and to get them to do what you want. It just can't happen, no matter how hard you try. But what you can do, which is vital as a Christian parent, as a grandparent, is to tell your kids, and I've told my children this more times than I care to count, and they all know it. You can fool me, you can fool your mom, you can fool the judge, you can fool the school teacher, you can fool the policeman, on and on and on. All those people may not be there. You may think that you've got them awful, but there's one person who's there that you also need to take into account, because this person's always there, and they always will be there. But to convey that to your kids, because there's going to come a time when they don't feel safe. I don't care who they are, when they're worried. And they have to be able to conjure up not simply the idea, but the raw truth that God is with them. They need to know, like Reginald Mallet was able to be shown by his dad, that his dad was there the whole time. Doesn't matter where they are, doesn't matter what's happening, doesn't matter how much they feel the world is falling apart, and they're not worth anything, and they're not loved, or they can't handle it, or it's overwhelming, or whatever it is, God is there. If you give them that feeling ahead of time, then you can teach them to conjure it up and to call upon it in such a way that it strengthens them. The last thing I want to say, by way of application to get you thinking, is it seems to me that as Christians, if we take this truth of God with us seriously, we need to reckon with the fact that it's really the shape of the whole of the Christian life. If you get a sense of how far down, if I can use that language, that God had to come, when you get His majesty and His awesomeness and His holiness fully fixed in your mind, and you realize the depth of God's, if I can use this language, condescension at Christmas, what you realize is when Jesus says to the disciples what He says to the disciples, He says something very profound. He says this, He says, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." That is to say, it's actually at Christmas that you have the model for the way in which Christians are to function no matter where they are. That is to say, always putting ourselves down in order to lift others up. So that effective Christian parenting is a parent who has the humility and the strength to try to figure out what their child is thinking in his or her own terms. The effective Christian teacher is the one who's so student-centered that he or she can sense what the students are actually going through and what they're thinking. And that takes effort. That takes work. That takes time. That takes real attention to detail. You don't learn how somebody else really ticks unless you live and move in their eyes and with their viewpoint. One of my favorite Indian sayings is, in order to fully understand a man, you need to walk for 2 miles in his moccasins. That gets my point across directly. So it's the whole shape of the Christian life. So whoever you are, whatever you're called to do, I know enough to know that there's things in your life that you're being called to do by God that need to have, if I can use this language, a Christmas shape. You need to be a boss at your place of work where you understand and care about your coworkers as if you understand what they're going through. You need to teach as if you understand your students. You need to be a parent or a godparent or a grandparent as if you have some idea of what it's like to be a grandchild and to feel like you can't figure things out. To have somebody read to you because nobody will read to you. To have somebody pay attention to you because nobody will pay attention to you. It's always amazing to me the things that people recall about what was significant about somebody after they go. One of the experiences I've had in parish ministry after I leave parishes, and I always get terrified by this, is people start the sentence and say, "The thing I'll always remember about Kendall is," and then they stop, and I'm terrified, because you don't know what they're going to say. But I'll never forget one woman, she said, "You always remember my name. You always call me by my name. You even, toward the end of your time, you gave me communion and you said my name." Now look, that took time. That took patience. There were hundreds of parishioners in that parish. But what she was saying is, you took me seriously. That was what she remembers. It's the kind of thing that people remember. So the question that we need to conclude with is, if God really is with us, and He is, if God with skin is who Jesus really is, then what are the ways in which we need to sacrifice ourselves and bow down ourselves and humiliate even ourselves and make ourselves low so that others can be lifted up. It's an awesome and a great truth. Fairest Lord Jesus, ruler of the heavens, the baby in the manger, the one who made the universe, God with us, God with skin. It's true. We can bank our lives on it.